I'm June, I'm 40. And 6 months ago, I restored my grandmother's house, the one my mother told me was haunted by cruelty and abandonment, and found between its walls the letters she had burned in our fireplace, the ones that proved my entire childhood was built on a pyre of someone else's silence. But that's the end, or the closest thing to an end I've found. To understand why I became a woman who spends her life restoring houses other people have left to rot, why I believed for 35 years that my grandmother was a monster I was lucky to escape, why I stood in a room full of strangers and watched my mother read her own teenage handwriting under glass, and finally understood that the cruelty I had been running from was the cruelty I had been living with. You have to understand the architecture of lies. How they need space to breathe. How they need walls and silence and someone willing to inherit them without asking what holds them up. I grew up in a house that was always temporary. Apartments mostly. Two-bedroom rentals with thin walls and landlords who raised the rent every spring. My mother, Diane, worked double shifts at a diner and then a hospital billing department, and she made sure I knew the cost of every watt of electricity, every load of laundry, every breath I took that wasn't directly contributing to our survival. Your grandmother had a house, she would say. Usually at the kitchen table over macaroni she had stretched with extra noodles to make it last. A big Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden full of roses, and she chose it over me. She chose wallpaper and china cabinets over her own daughter. I was 6 when I first heard this story. I was 16 when I added my own embellishments to it, telling friends that my grandmother was a drunk, a hoarder, a woman who had thrown my pregnant teenage mother out into the snow. By the time I was 25, my grandmother was a mythological figure in my personal pantheon of villains, as real to me as any character in the novels I read to escape our apartment's smell of mildew and disappointment. Diane was a master of the narrative arc. She knew that a story needs a victim and a villain, and she had cast herself in the role she was born to play. She was the mother who had sacrificed everything, her youth, her education, her dreams of being a nurse, so that her daughter could have a life. She was the woman who had been abandoned by her own mother, who had learned the hard way that family was a transaction, and who had nevertheless given me everything she had. I don't want you to make my mistakes, she would say, usually when I wanted to visit a friend's house, or apply to a college out of state, or date a boy who didn't meet her standards of dependability. I don't want you to end up alone, with nothing, like your grandmother left me. I believed her. I believed her because children believe their mothers the way plants believe in sunlight, and because Diane's performance of sacrifice was so complete that questioning it felt like a moral failure. She cried at my high school graduation, not with pride, but with a complex grief that seemed to encompass my leaving, her own lost opportunities, and the general cruelty of a world that made mothers suffer for their children's success. She refused to let me pay for college, though I offered, working summers and saving everything. Instead, she took out loans in her name, loans I would later discover she never intended to repay, and presented them to me like offerings on an altar. This is what mothers do, she said. This is what your grandmother never did for me. I became a historic preservationist because I was obsessed with houses, not the architecture, though I learned to love that too, the proportions of Victorian gables, the craftsmanship of hand-planed wood, the way light moves through leaded glass. I was obsessed with what houses remember. The layers of wallpaper, each one covering but not erasing the pattern beneath. The notches in door frames where generations of children measured themselves. The spaces between walls where insulation settles into the shapes of long-gone drafts. I believed, without articulating it, that if I could learn to read houses, I could learn to read my own history. I could find the truth that my mother had buried under so many layers of narrative. I married at 27, divorced at 31. The marriage was brief and undramatic, a mismatch of ambitions that ended with mutual shrugs and the division of books. I kept my maiden name, Brennan, though Diane had suggested I take my husband's. Your father's name, she said, though she never spoke of my father, a man who had apparently disappeared before I was born, another ghost in her gallery of abandonment. Brennan is your grandmother's name, you don't want to be tied to that. I had Willa when I was 34. Pregnancy was deliberate, solitary, a choice I made after the divorce when I realized that the family I wanted was not going to arrive through traditional channels. Diane was furious, not because I was single but because I had made a choice without her. You're repeating my pattern, she said. Alone, struggling, thinking you can do everything yourself. Your grandmother would be proud. I didn't understand then that this was her greatest fear, not my failure but my independence, not my loneliness, but my capacity to build a life that didn't require her sacrifice as its foundation. Willa was 2 when the letter arrived. I found it in our mailbox, an envelope with legal letterhead, the kind that usually means bad news or bureaucracy. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where Diane had told me about the haunted house, and I read it 3 times before the words arranged themselves into meaning. Catherine Brennan, my grandmother, had died 14 months earlier. She had left me her house, the Victorian with the wraparound porch, the house where Diane had grown up, the house of the monster. I called Diane that evening. I remember the sound of the television in her apartment, the canned laughter of a sitcom she watched but never seemed to enjoy. "Mom," I said, "I got a letter about Grandma Catherine's house." The silence was immediate, not surprised, calculated. "She's dead. 14 months ago. She left me the house in Millbrook." "Burn it down," Diane said. Her voice was flat, without inflection, as if she were commenting on weather. "Sell the land, take whatever money you can get and never go there. That woman destroyed my life, June. She doesn't get to reach from the grave and poison yours." I should have asked questions. I should have heard the panic beneath the flatness, the way her breathing had accelerated, the fact that she had known Catherine was dead for 14 months and never told me. But I was trained in a lifetime of not asking, of accepting the narrative as presented, of understanding that my mother's pain was the gravity that held my world in orbit. "I want to see it," I said. "I'm a preservationist. It's my job." "Your job," Diane repeated. The word sounded like an accusation. "Your job is to take care of your daughter. Your job is to not make the same mistakes I made. Your job is to be grateful for the mother who stayed, not curious about the one who left." We argued for an hour. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, which meant it was full of ellipses and silences and things said sideways. Diane threatened to disown me. She threatened to tell Willa, when she was old enough to understand, that her mother had chosen a dead woman's house over her own family. She wept. She performed grief with the precision of a veteran actress, and I watched her, and for the first time I felt something other than sympathy. I felt suspicion, not of her story, but of its architecture, the way it required me to be a certain shape to fit inside it. I went to Millbrook the following weekend. Willa was with Diane, an arrangement I made with the same mechanical warmth I used for dentist's appointments. I drove 3 hours through country that grew progressively older, the highways giving way to state roads, the state roads to county routes, the county routes to a dirt track that ended at a gate overgrown with honeysuckle. The house sat at the top of a rise, visible before I reached it, and I understood immediately why my mother had described it as haunted. Not because it was frightening, but because it was beautiful in a way that made her story impossible. The wraparound porch was sagging but intact, the columns hand-turned, the gingerbread trim still clinging to the eaves like lace. The garden was a wilderness of roses gone feral, climbing the fence, and the porch railings, and the weathered trellis that had once supported them. The house was not the den of a monster. It was the home of someone who had loved something enough to let it grow beyond control. I spent the first day simply walking through rooms. The furniture was draped in sheets that had become gray with dust and light. The kitchen still held dishes in the drainboard, as if someone had washed up after dinner and never returned. Upstairs, in what must have been the master bedroom, I found a bed with a quilt folded at the foot, and on the pillow, a depression that might have been a head or might have been decades of gravity. I lay down on the quilt, and I smelled cedar and lavender, and something else, something I would later identify as the particular absence of a person who had lived alone for a very long time. I didn't find the letters that first day, or the second. I spent a week in the house, sleeping on the quilt in the master bedroom, eating food from the grocery in town, beginning the slow inventory that would eventually become a restoration plan. I documented water damage and structural settling and the beautiful, terrible evidence of deferred maintenance. I photographed the layers of wallpaper in the front parlor, 7 distinct patterns going back to 1890, each one a decision made by someone who wanted to change the appearance without altering the structure. I found the notches in the kitchen door frame, generations of children measuring themselves, and I ran my fingers over them, and I wondered which one had been my mother's, and whether she had stood there proudly or resentfully, already planning her escape. On the 8th day, I began work on the back bedroom, a small room at the end of the upstairs hall that had apparently been used for storage. The plaster was damaged, water stained from a roof leak that had been patched but not properly repaired. I started removing the damaged section, cutting carefully with a utility knife, planning to document the lath and plaster construction before replacing it with modern materials. The lath came away easily, too easily, and I realized that someone had already removed this section once before. The plaster behind it was newer, the lath spaced differently, and when I shone my flashlight into the cavity, I saw the box. It was a metal document box, the kind sold in office supply stores in the 1980s, green with a handle on top and a clasp that had rusted shut. It had been sealed with tape that had yellowed and cracked, and when I cut it away and forced the clasp, the lid opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, bundled with rubber bands that had hardened into brittle rings. I took the box to the kitchen table, the same table where Diane had told me about this house, though I didn't make that connection until later, and I began to read. The first letter was dated June 14, 1986. Diane would have been 16. The handwriting was my mother's, unmistakable even in its youth. The same loops and slants I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes she left on my school lunches. "Dear Mom," it began. The word struck me like a physical blow. Not Dear Catherine, not Dear Mrs. Brennan. Mom, the monster had been Mom. I know you don't understand why I left. I know you think I'm throwing away my future. But I can't stay in that house anymore, with your rules and your church friends and your constant watching. I'm not your little girl anymore. I'm going to make my own life, and when I'm famous or successful or just happy, you'll see that you were wrong about everything. I read through the bundle. There were 37 letters in all, spanning from 1986 to 1992. The early ones were angry, adolescent, full of the grandiose certainty that Diane had never entirely lost. They accused Catherine of being controlling, old-fashioned, obsessed with appearances. They demanded money, apologies, freedom. They threatened to never return, to never speak to her again, to change her name and disappear so completely that Catherine would never find her. But mixed in with Diane's letters were copies of Catherine's responses. I found them in a separate bundle, typed on an old manual typewriter, the kind with a ribbon that left impressions you could feel with your fingertips. "Dear Diane," they began. "Always Dear Diane. Never angry, never defensive, full of a patience that made me ache. I received your letter of June 14th. I understand that you feel trapped. I understand that you want to make your own decisions, but I need you to understand that I love you and that love means wanting to keep you safe. If you need space, I will give you space. But please, please tell me where you are. Let me know you're okay. You don't have to come home. Just let me know you're alive." The letters continued in this vein for months. Catherine writing weekly, sometimes daily. Diane responding sporadically, her tone shifting from angry to demanding to eventually something else. Something I had never heard in my mother's voice. Fear. The letter dated October 3, 1986 changed everything. Diane wrote, "I need money, not a loan, a gift. I'm in trouble and it's your fault for not preparing me for the real world. If you really loved me, you'd send it without questions. If you don't, I'll know you never cared about me at all." Catherine's response, dated October 5th, "I will send you money, I will send you whatever you need, but I need to know you're safe, I need to know where you are, I need to know what kind of trouble. Please, Diane, I'm your mother, let me help you properly." There was no response from Diane for 3 months. Then, a letter dated January 12, 1987, "I'm pregnant. Don't try to find me. Don't tell anyone. If you do, I'll tell them you threw me out because of it and you'll never see your grandchild. Send $500 to the address below. I'll write again when I need more." I sat at the kitchen table for an hour, the letter in my hands, my body completely still. I was born in August of 1987. My mother had been pregnant when she wrote this. She had been 16 alone, and she had used her pregnancy as leverage against her mother. Not as a tragedy, as a transaction. I read through the remaining letters with a kind of terrible clarity. Catherine had sent money, always with pleas for information, for contact, for some proof that Diane was safe. Diane had responded with increasing coldness, treating her mother like an ATM that had the unfortunate habit of asking about her feelings. In 1988, Catherine hired a private investigator. The report was included in the box, a summary of findings that described Diane living in a boarding house in Albany, working as a cashier, raising an infant alone. The investigator had recommended approaching her directly. Catherine's handwritten note on the report. She said she'd disappear if I found her. "I can't risk losing my daughter. I can't risk losing my granddaughter." In 1989, the tone of Diane's letters shifted again. She began to mention a new life, a fresh start, decision to put the past behind me. She thanked Catherine for the money, the only thanks in any of the letters, and she promised to visit soon. She never did. In 1990, she wrote to announce that she had enrolled in a nursing program, that she was finally becoming the person I was meant to be, and that she didn't need any more support. "I'm grateful for everything," she wrote, the words sitting on the page like a landmine, "but it's time for me to stand on my. Please don't write anymore. I need to focus on my future without the weight of the past." Catherine's final letter, dated March 1992, was not addressed to Diane, it was addressed to me. "Dear June," it began, my name in her typewriter's careful impressions. "If you are reading this, it means your mother has kept these letters, which is more than I hoped for and less than I dreamed. I want you to know that I loved your mother. I loved her even when she hated me, even when she used you as a weapon against me, even when she told me that any contact from me would destroy her new life. I want you to know that I paid for her nursing school, and for your preschool, and for 100 things she told you were scholarships or grants or her own hard work. I want you to know that I watched you from a distance, at a park in Albany when you were 3, at a school play when you were 6, from a car across the street because your mother had warned me that if I came closer, she would tell you I was a monster and you would believe her. I am not a monster, June. I am an old woman who made the terrible choice to let her daughter control the narrative, because the alternative was losing her entirely. I hope that when you are old enough to wonder about me, you will find these letters, and you will understand that love sometimes takes the shape of absence, and that absence is not the same as abandonment. I hope you will forgive me for being weak. I hope you will forgive your mother for being angry. And I hope you will know, with a certainty I never had, that you were loved by both of us, even when love looked like silence. I read the letter 3 times. Then I went outside and I sat on the porch steps and I watched the sun set over the feral roses and I cried for the first time since Willa was born. Not delicate tears, body-shaking sobs that came from a place deeper than my own history, from the accumulated grief of 2 women who had loved each other badly, and a third who had been caught between them without knowing she was in a war. I didn't call Diane. Not that night, not the next day. I spent a week in the house, reading and rereading the letters, tracing the patterns of their damage, understanding finally that the architecture of my childhood had been built on a foundation I had never been allowed to inspect. I found the payment records Catherine had kept, the canceled checks for Diane's education, the receipts for the scholarships that had funded my own. I found photographs of myself at 3, at 6, at 10, taken from a distance, my face turned away or blurred by motion, the evidence of a grandmother who had loved me in the only way she had been permitted. I found something else too. In the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, was a smaller envelope, unsealed, containing a single page. It was a police report dated 1987 from the Albany Police Department, a complaint filed by Diane Brennan, age 16, accusing a teacher at her high school of inappropriate conduct. The case had been closed without charges. The teacher's name was Martin Hale. The report noted that the complainant had refused to provide details, had recanted 2 days later, and had left town shortly thereafter. There was a handwritten note at the bottom, in Catherine's careful script. Diane told me he hurt her. Then she told me never to speak of it. I don't know what to believe. I only know that my daughter left, and that she has never told me the whole truth, and that I have failed her in ways I cannot name. I sat with that report for a long time. I understood, without knowing the specifics, that my mother's story was more complicated than she had ever admitted. That her anger at Catherine might have roots in something real, something that had happened before the letters began, something that had made her flee not from a controlling mother, but from a trauma she couldn't speak. And I understood that Catherine had known this, had suspected it, had spent decades paying for silence that protected someone else while it destroyed her relationship with her daughter. But understanding is not forgiveness. And forgiveness, I was learning, is not a requirement. I spent the summer restoring the house. Willa was with me, her small hands helping with tasks that mostly created more work, her questions about Grandma's house becoming more frequent as the rooms took shape. I told her that her great-grandmother had lived here, that she had loved flowers, that she had been a kind woman who had made a mistake a long time ago. I did not tell her about the letters. I did not tell her about Diane's threats or Catherine's silence, or the police report that I had read and reread until its edges were soft with handling. These were adult complexities, and Willa was 6, and I was trying to build something solid for her that did not require her to bear the weight of generations. Diane called weekly. I answered with a warmth that felt increasingly like performance, the same performance I had learned from watching her. I told her about the restoration in general terms, avoiding specifics, avoiding any mention of discoveries. She warned me against becoming obsessed with the house, against wasting my inheritance on a building that should have been sold. She told me stories about her childhood there, new stories, darker than the ones I had heard before. The locked attic, the strict church attendance, the friends she wasn't allowed to have. I listened, and I compared them to the letters, and I understood that both versions were true and both were incomplete, that memory is not a recording but a reconstruction, and that my mother had spent 40 years reconstructing hers into a fortress that could not be breached. In August, I made a decision. I would finish the restoration. I would make the house livable, beautiful, a place where Willa could grow up surrounded by the evidence that families could be complicated without being cruel, and I would invite Diane to see it. Not for reconciliation, for confrontation. For the opportunity to tell her, in the space where the truth had been buried, that I knew what she had done. I prepared carefully. I had the letters copied and bound. I had the financial records organized. I had the police report in a folder that I would offer her if the moment seemed right. If she seemed ready to acknowledge that her story had shadows she had never illuminated, I did not expect her to apologize. I expected her to perform, to deny, to reconstruct the fortress in real time. But I needed her to know that I had seen the foundation, that I was no longer willing to live in a house whose structure I could not inspect. She arrived on a Saturday in September, the day after the restoration was officially complete. I had hired a local contractor to help with the structural work, but I had done much of the finishing myself. The sanding, the painting, the selection of wallpapers that honored the history without freezing it in time. The house looked like what it was, a place that had been damaged and repaired, that bore the marks of its history without being defined by them. Diane stepped out of her car and looked at the house for a long moment. I watched her face, searching for the emotions I had learned to read in my own daughter: surprise, recognition, memory. But Diane's expression was controlled, curated, the face she wore for difficult audiences. "It's smaller than I remember," she said. "Or maybe I was smaller, that's how childhood works." We walked through the rooms. I had prepared a tour, pointing out the original features I had preserved, the modern updates I had added, the choices I had made to balance respect for the past with practicality for the future. Diane nodded at appropriate moments, made appropriate comments, performed the role of interested mother with the same precision she had always brought to our interactions. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes moved to the back bedroom, the one where I had found the box. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. "Storage," I said. "For now. I'm thinking of making it Willa's room when she's older." Diane nodded. We continued the tour. We had lunch on the porch, sandwiches I had prepared, lemonade from the lemons that grew in the garden Catherine had planted and I had restored. Diane talked about her work, her friends, the television shows she was watching. She did not ask about the letters. She did not mention Catherine. She acted as if this were a normal visit, a normal house, a normal relationship between a mother and daughter who shared a history of mutual support. After lunch, I excused myself to check on Willa, who was napping upstairs. When I returned, Diane was gone from the porch. I found her in the back bedroom, standing in the center of the empty space, looking at the wall where the plaster had been removed and replaced. She turned when I entered, and her face was different. The mask had slipped. I saw fear and grief and something else, recognition, perhaps, or the dawning understanding that the fortress had been breached. "You found them," she said. It was not a question. "I found them," I agreed. She sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, her legs folding beneath her with the suddenness of a collapse. "I was going to tell you," she said. "Someday, when you were old enough, when you could understand." "I'm 40, I said. "How old is old enough?" Diane laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you knew about her, if you knew what she did, what she didn't do, you'd hate me too, or worse, you'd love her. You'd go to her and she'd tell you her version, and I'd lose you the way I lost everything else." I sat down across from her, the bound copies of the letters between us like a wall we were both trying to scale. "She didn't abandon you," I said. "You left, you threatened her. You used me as leverage, and she spent the rest of her life paying for your silence while you told me she was a monster." "She was." Diane's voice cracked, the first genuine emotion I had heard. "She was controlling and strict, and she never listened to me, never believed me, never." She stopped, took a breath. "There were things I couldn't tell her, things I couldn't tell anyone. And when I needed her to just trust me, to just let me go without questions, she couldn't do it. She had to know everything. She had to fix everything, and I couldn't let her fix this." I understood then, or I thought I understood. The police report, the recanted accusation, the flight from home, the pregnancy, the lifetime of narrative construction that had made Diane the victim and Catherine the villain. "Martin Hale," I said. "The teacher, you told her he hurt you, then you told her never to speak of it. Why?" Diane's face went white. "You found that. It's in the box with everything else." She was silent for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the air between us. "He didn't hurt me," she said finally. Not the way she thought, not the way I said. I was 16 and stupid, and I thought I was in love with him, and when he ended it, when he told me he had a wife, I was angry. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to hurt everyone. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I couldn't tell her that, couldn't tell her that the baby was." She stopped again. "I couldn't tell her the truth, so I told her a lie that was bigger than the truth. I told her she had failed me. I told her I was leaving and never coming back. And when she found me anyway, when she hired that detective, I told her that if she came near me, if she told anyone about the baby, I would say she threw me out. I would say she was the reason I was pregnant. I would destroy her." And she let you, I said. She paid for your school. She paid for my preschool. She watched me from a distance because you told her that any contact would destroy your new life. She spent 30 years in silence because you threatened her with exactly what you did, telling me she was a monster. Diane looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother without her performance. I saw a 60-year-old woman sitting on a restored floor in her childhood home, surrounded by the evidence of her own construction, and I saw that the fortress had not been built to keep me out. It had been built to keep her in. To protect her from a truth she had never been able to face. That she had been 16 and stupid and angry, that she had made choices that cascaded into decades of silence, that she had sacrificed her mother's love for the protection of a lie that had become her only identity. I was so angry, she whispered. At her, at him, at myself. And the only way I could survive was to be right, to be the victim, to make her the villain, and it worked. It worked so well that I forgot it was a story. I forgot you were real, that you had a right to know her, that I was stealing your grandmother to protect my own shame. I didn't reach for her. I didn't offer comfort. I had spent 40 years being the audience for her performance, and I was no longer willing to play that role. But I didn't hate her either. I saw, with a clarity that felt like the light moving across the floor, that she was as damaged as the house had been, as in need of restoration, as marked by the choices of generations. The difference was that houses could be repaired. People had to repair themselves. I've restored the house, I said. I'm going to live here with Willa, and I'm going to tell her the truth. Not your version, not Catherine's version, but the truth, that her grandmother was a complicated woman who made terrible choices out of fear, and that her great-grandmother was a complicated woman who made terrible choices out of love, and that both of them loved her, even when love looked like silence, even when love looked like absence. Diane nodded. She didn't argue, she didn't reconstruct the fortress. She simply sat there, aging in the afternoon light, and let the story she had built crumble around her. I didn't invite her to stay. I didn't invite her to leave. I stood up and I walked out of the room, and I found Willa awake and asking for juice, and I held her in my arms, and I smelled her hair, and I understood that the house I had restored was not just a building. It was a promise. A promise that the next generation would grow up knowing that truth was not a threat, that love did not require performance, that the space between walls could hold secrets but did not have to hold silence. Diane left that evening. She didn't say goodbye. She walked to her car and drove away, and I watched her go from the porch, the same porch where Catherine had presumably watched her leave 40 years before. I didn't know if I would see her again. I didn't know if the silence between us would become absence, or if absence could eventually become something else. But I knew that I had made my choice. I had chosen truth over comfort, complexity over narrative, and the hard work of restoration over the easy performance of destruction. I turned the back bedroom into a study. I mounted the letters in frames, not as accusations, but as evidence of the human capacity for both damage and repair. I hung Catherine's final letter on the wall, where I could see it every morning, and I read it to Willa when she was old enough to understand, not as a lesson in blame, but as a lesson in the shapes that love can take. The house is warm now. The roses are tamed, though I left some of the wild growth because it reminded me that beauty does not require control. Willa has her own notch in the kitchen doorframe, and sometimes, when I measure her, I think of all the children who stood in that same spot, and I hope that they knew they were loved, even when love was imperfect, even when love was silent, even when love took the shape of absence because presence was too dangerous to risk. That's my story. If someone ever told you that your family was a simple story of villains and victims, if someone ever asked you to choose between two versions of the truth, if someone ever made you believe that love could only exist in one form, hear me. Love is not a narrative. Love is not a performance. Love is the work of restoration, the slow and difficult process of removing the layers that hide the structure, of repairing the damage without erasing the history, of building something solid that can hold the weight of generations. You are not the story someone else told about you. You are the house you choose to build, and the foundation you choose to inspect, and the truth you choose to live with even when it is complicated, even when it is painful, even when it requires you to sit in a restored room with your mother and watch her fortress crumble and know that you cannot rebuild it for her. You are the restoration. You are the work, and the work is enough.